It's called Rustic and Tardiness. I'm going to share very, very quick. Some of you are very familiar with by now with the studio and the site. But for those of you who are not, let me share, hold on a second, very, very quick while I'm talking. Some basic information about the site, which is something I usually never do. And I will be the first one to admit that the importance of this is relative in the studio, but nevertheless, I think it's worth to share it. I've been teaching the semester, co-teaching with Joy Day, which I want to thank her for all her work. And we have as a guest Professor Pedro Ferracini from Rosario, recent graduate from SCI-Arc. And as I said, the name of the studio is called Rustic and Tardiness. And the site that we give them is the one on the right. The one on the left is the city of Rosario, the city where I grew up. And many of you live or were born in it. And I think this is by far the most, the biggest group of people from Rosario I ever have in a review. But the site that we give them is the one in the right, which is the Delta, the Islands Delta, which is right across the river from the city, and it's incredibly virgin and natural territory with a lot of stream. The other thing that we wanted to look was to look at certain primitive or traditions and to refigure it out how we can recombine them with digital technology and different tools that we use in animation software, artificial intelligence, or whatever else the students felt like using. So we did like a quick survey, but also they brought things from their own culture. As a way to what I would say to emphasize what to me is one of the most interesting topics of computers, which is the possibility of new coherencies, the possibility that you can mix a lot of things that maybe at first glance will not make sense, but then you can filter it and introduce them as new possibilities or new agencies of contamination. This is a little bit very much inspired by the way that we are working today. And Mark Bradford, the fantastic artist from LA, he mentioned that why in the art world, and this I think can apply to architecture, cannot unpack things and sort of making hybrid notions over practice. This is something that happened in music through sampling and remixing. So this is a little bit the spirit of the logic that we were looking for, to really take full potential to mix match things. You will see, some of you have been in other reviews, you will see certain familiarities, but these were some of the things that we were looking, and certain traditions and certain things about the culture of Argentina, or somebody like Gustavo Cerati, who will use computers, but also mixing local sounds, or the work of Fabian, who we have here, which I will say that even though with all the innovation, there is a fundamental raw quality that comes from the horizontality and the Pampa of Argentina. This is the city of Rosario. This is the area. We didn't give them a specific site. We give them the whole territory, and we gave a lot of freedom to the students to define the scale of the scope that they want to work. You will see that project with very aggressive, almost a territorial, and some of them they're very small and singular, and we were fine with that. We were looking at some of the nature and vegetations and things that happen in there, the infrastructure, the way that the things live and how the things people use it there, and also some of the extreme conditions that happen with floods or other natural phenomena, but with the idea to really introduce the possibility to create this artificial nature or natural artificiality. So this is one of the views from the island when they're a little bit flood into the city. And this is a wonderful aerial view. So I know I'm going fast, but because I want to get to the students. So in a way, I would argue it's one of the most open studios that we've ever done for those of you who are being in reviews before. And of course, there's a component of distortion, deformation, mutations, and so on. And as I said, each of the students approach in a different way. I think there is certain common areas of interest. Absurdity and ridiculousness is not only supported but encouraged. So you will see a lot of strange ideas to operate. But again, the notion was to use this notion of sampling and mixing, and the idea of nature, infrastructure, architecture, all of them being very ambiguous about it, giving them a lot of areas to speculate where the things will operate, how we can deal with this territory, how we can deal with these forms of nature in proximity with 1.5 million density, a pre-dense city. And some of our guest critics today, they were guest speakers during the semester, people who have first-hand knowledge about the context, the traditions, the contemporary, and I think in one way or another, this has been an incredibly fantastic opportunity. I want to thank the students for the extraordinary effort in these horrible times. I think the work that they accomplished is really, really exquisite and committed and passionate. And hopefully this will trigger an interesting conversation. This is one of the studios that kind of everything goes in terms of the argument of the conversation. So we have a lot of critics because I think it's important for everybody to have the chance to talk, but also for alleviate the pressures on the critics that they don't feel that they have to talk in every project or anything and you can take a break. I think we're all completely exhausted by Zoom by now. So we're going to try to do it as expedient and fun and relaxed as possible. So as I said, Joy Day co-teach with me, and we counted with the support of Pedro Ferracini. So let me introduce our extraordinary jury. And I only would ask you that you just say hi, so your box in Zoom light up, so everybody knows who you are. We have Galia Solomonov, architect in New York, professor at Columbia University from Rosario.
Hello, Hernan. Nice to see everyone.
Today, I'm going to address where you're from. Ana Valderrama, which I don't know if she's yet with us, but if not, she will be joining us in a bit. She's a professor on the National University in Rosario, former vice dean, leader of research group, work in the master in the landscape program, and a really fantastic collaborator in this process. We have Agustina Gonzalez Cid, the current planning secretary of the city of Rosario.
Hi, hello, everyone.
Then we have some of our own fantastic faculty, Marcel Ingao.
Hi.
Faculty and SCI-Arc channel producer and many other hats in the school. We have Seina Sorestein here with us, professor here at the school, also practicing architect in Los Angeles. Seina, thank you for joining us. Then we have Fabian Marcacho, painter, artist from New York, but originally from Rosario as well, where you already have the pleasure to meet in conversations.
Hello, everybody.
We have Sir Peter Cook from London, almost midnight in London. Thank you, Peter, for being such a trooper, like always. Appreciate it. Gerardo Caballero, architect and professor in Rosario. He taught for many years in Washington University in St. Louis and many schools in Spain. And also you met already when he gave us a wonderful talk about his work. Gerardo, thank you for coming.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Ferda Colatam, professor at Penn, occasional, very frequent guest professor at SCI-Arc, an old friend of the house. Ferda, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Jeremy Kamal Hartley, faculty at SCI-Arc, landscape architect, filmmaker, creative director, and many more things. Jeremy, thank you for joining us again.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you all again.
Jacqueline Ha Bloom, professor at the school, professor here at SCI-Arc, and also practicing architect in Los Angeles. Jacqueline, thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone.
And I think last but not least, and I hope I didn't forget anybody because there are so many of you, William Virgil, faculty and the school, also coordinator of the Making a Meaning program. So thank you, William, for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Hernan, for the invitation.
One quick announcement, Seina is one of the co-curators of the spring show. It's gonna be a fantastic show, so stay tuned and pay attention to see what she and Natu are done together. It's gonna be a really cool thing. So I just want to use this time to announce that. So without any further ado, Joy, why don't you get us started?
Thanks, Hernan. Up first, we have two students presenting, Melody and Ying. So Melody, go ahead and share your screen and we'll get started with that.
Hi, I would like to say hi to all the critics. I'm Melody, and I would also like to say hi to Peter. If you remember me, I worked for you 2 years ago. So it was, Yeah, it was really nervous to present in front of you for the first time. Yeah, but I will share screen now. Can you guys see it? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about my project. So my project is about the synthesis of the natural and artificial qualities of the site in Rosario. In the beginning, I start to look into stone forms and different kind of natural growing patterns of organic objects found on the site. I then integrate different kind of mechanical parts and supportings, almost like prosthetics to these generated forms. And for the final, like I imagine the design form to kind of be like, have a variety of different scale and performances. So you can see that some of them, they are smaller, and I see them as kind of like a bird nest for bird to inhabit in. And some of them, they can be elevated above the river, and some of them, they situate within the forest. And for the animation, it's kind of like a fictional representation of a meandering journey, almost as if you yourself are one of the viewers, and you're meandering through the forest, and you see different kind of queer object through the journey. So this is kind of like how I intend to present it in the animation. So I think it should be yin yings for to present.
Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Ying Ying Hu. I'm gonna share my screen right now. The name of the project derives from a Spanish word cerrito, referring to a type of ancient mound construction of South America. A mound builder would bury all kinds of things beneath the earth to form a cerrito. It would probably be in a multifunctional context and was strategically located for gathering of natural resources, as well as a dwelling and a funerary monument. It may also become habitat for wildlife. Architecturally speaking, a cerrito provides many opportunities. This project proposes a new public land that overhangs above the bank of Delta River, facing Rosario Central Stadium across the river. Cerrito-like volumes are connected and constructs a vast habitable land for people in the wild area, while the top surface provides levels of ground accessible for constantly undulating water level. The undulated underbelly provides well-shaded space for diverse wildlife. Thank you.
Joy, maybe we can flip back and forth between both presentations.
All right.
Hernan, now that we do these videos, is the idea that the students or that we don't discuss it, that they don't present the projects verbally, that we get a sense?
It's up to each of the students. Some of them tends to be more, some of them, it's up to them how much they want to explain, how much they don't want to explain.
Okay.
Some of them record a voice during the video, some of them take a time to explain. So no, we gave them total latitude with that.
Because I think the one of the things that makes it difficult to start the conversation is that I experience them, both videos, aesthetically, they're beautiful, but almost it's hard to start to say something other than how they appear, how their physical attractiveness in a way. Does that make sense?
I think it's a fair point, but also I think it's totally fair game to ask them what if there's anything else. I don't, Jeremy, you're.
Well, yeah, I think it's there's a way to stay in the context of the world that is set here and just kind of look at the rules that are being set and talk about it from there. And in this case, I feel like I'm just curious about, so you have this structure, and I appreciate the word prosthetic. You know, I like that you've differentiated those two aspects of the structure that you've created, because I think looking at this project before, that was one of the things that stood out, is that there's a distinction between those black elements and then these kind of this organic form that you have. But what I really appreciated most about this, and I guess it's kind of in both of those projects, is the idea of the microhabitat and the microclimate. And I feel like it would have been interesting when I saw the bird in the nest, that's when I was like, oh, this is lit. Like, this is really cool. I like where this is going. But I felt like it felt more like a passive type of thing. Something dropped on the ground and the bird occupied it. And I was wondering if there was more intention into like how that structure facilitates that particular species of bird, and also like getting into the local, you know, fauna, the local animals of this region. Like if there's a way that this structure can actually speak specifically where like no other bird occupies that, only that bird can occupy it, or only this insect can. But I appreciate the opening of this structure because you have that flexibility where maybe to the comment said before, it's not that we know immediately what to make of it. So you get to create that own narrative, your own narrative. And I think that where you were going with that narrative is very interesting, but I think it could be pushed. Like what do those prosthetics do with, how do the prosthetics work with that natural form? So it's not just here's a natural form and something inhabits it because it looks quote unquote natural, but there's an actual functionality that you're introducing that makes this specific to this kind of natural, you know, climate that you're dealing with. And with the melody, I appreciate the, and also the choice in music. I'm curious about the choice of and music for both. One of them, the tonality was pretty on point, but the other one felt like I was walking into like a very chic fashion store. And it's just like the curiosity as to like what that reason was behind that, because I feel like it gives a different feeling towards what we're watching. But in this one, what I appreciate is the understanding of microclimate in a very different way. The idea that the surface that a sun hits and doesn't hit are two different climates completely. And I think this one, it would have been nice to really push. I loved when we went to the underside of the structure, and the underside felt different. It felt like it could be cooler, more vegetated. And I'm interested in like how what was kind of like something that was, I wish would have happened is a complete change in the vegetation according to the actual, you know, vegetation that exists in this area. But on the surface, I feel like there should be a completely different type. It looks like, see here on the top where the sun is hitting, it's almost the same vegetation. Or I want to see that deliberance of when the sun hits the surface here, the vegetation takes on this pattern versus when it's in shade, and really allowing that structure to follow those rule sets, because I feel like that's something that this one is starting to hit. But you know, it's addressing it, but I think it could be pushed further. Wherever the sun hits on the surface, on a mountainside, all the vegetation respond to a whole new different rule than the back of the mountain where it's shaded. And being able that there's a very strong distinction between those two surfaces. And I think it could be pushed in this one, but I do appreciate how the camera went down, and it really did feel different. I really did feel like you've acknowledged that the climate is different underneath, and I think you brought it up.
I think to jump in quickly, I mean, I think there are actually a whole number of ways of talking about the projects. I think Jeremy is pointing out some of the functional and performative aspects that can sort of come in and define more specifically certain kinds of behavioral modes that the architecture displays. I think to me, there's another aspect as well. I think, you know, these projects are beautiful. Just to sort of reiterate that as well, I think both of them are quite stunning in many ways. But my main interest at this moment, at least, I would say in regard to this project, both of them would be, it appears they're looking to define a kind of new aesthetic language for a rather strange world that we inhabit. And that has something to do with a changing concept of nature. This comes at the heels of another review I was on at SCI-Arc last night, Synthetic Natures, which deals with similar issues in a very, very different way, I would argue. But in general, this notion that we can no longer clearly or categorically separate between the realms of culture and technology and nature, that those sort of modernist ways of thinking about the world no longer apply because of the Anthropocene, et cetera, et cetera. And so if we have to rewrite the rules, and if we have to cross-fertilize in ways that no longer upheld and reinforce those boundaries, you know, what can we create as designers, as architects? Sure, it is important that these things function and have some kind of a performative value, but also what kind of identity would this new world, these new kinds of categories, or the mixing of these categories bring along? To me, that's a really interesting question. And I find that both these projects, to me, do that in their own way. So this one, the first one, much more as a prosthesis, as was already pointed out, a kind of a mixture between something that is seemingly organic, but also brings in all kinds of sci-fi motifs, and then the sort of mechanical that does express itself as radically different than the organic, but they come together and they sort of combine into a cyborgian kind of quality in a model like this, while the other one to me is much more sort of kind of an artificial or synthetic landscape, where the boundaries between quote unquote nature that is more perceived in the traditional sense, and then this kind of new nature that's being put to play in the architecture itself begin to sort of walk around each other, get close to each other, and there's some kind of overlap. And then when you think the overlap is becoming a demarcation between two material realities, you realize that it moves into a third reality, like the green becomes color, the color becomes skin, becomes texture. And there's a really beautiful kind of transition of these types of qualities, which brings almost a kind of a new type of painterly into the concept of architecture. And that painterly is sort of expanding into concepts of nature and principles of nature, again, through things like color and organicity and texture and so forth. So I think, to me, that's a really interesting framework that I read in these projects. And I don't know, but I find that just sort of jumps out to me, at least sort of as a first comment.
I really want to walk into the project because I like to take projects like this, not just as a sort of exercise, but really to believe. I want to believe into them. And but you take yourself with you. You know, I think confronted with any kind of environment, whether it's artificial or a strange one, some part of your psychology clings on to what you know. And I thought that Jeremy's observations about the underside and the top of the objects was in a way a tectonic conversation, but also it was one to do with sort of what do you cling on to. If you go into a very strange place, there's a certain moment, certainly for somebody like myself, that you still want to cling on, it's almost to the invisible handrail. And what I found very interesting in Melody's project, for example, was where we suddenly hit a staircase that looks like a staircase. And I didn't know whether that was to what extent that was a deliberate sort of suddenly up front. Suddenly we've seen something, and in fact, it's a rather rustic staircase. It's neither here nor there, but it was suddenly the sort of the normal remnant of the world that we know. Did we need that? Was it trying to make the point of the difference of the rest of the environment, or was it trying to say, well, here is a kind of a sort of referencing? And I thought that thinking in my own mind, I thought, well, now there's a very interesting territory there where to what extent could the staircase be developed until you were aware of something that you could step on and sit on perhaps, but to what extent it would actually also be a very ambiguous thing. And so there's this question of the sort of what is ambiguous and what is reminiscent. And I think that it's so that one hopes that as this kind of architecture can develop, the way of giving clues, of giving reassurance, of giving sudden mystery. If you think of the history of architecture, very, very good architects are able to create within it a kind of theatre of different conditions within possibly the same language. Now here we have an architecture, and so to some extent it's a pictorial reference, to some extent it's interested in the way of molding and folding and melting and transmogrifying. On the other hand, you are in it, and that's why I say I take it quite seriously. To what extent then do we need these things? For example, in the second project, we almost have something that can be almost subconsciously seen as the city. It's almost saying these these are buildings. They're not buildings with which we're familiar, but they could well be. The city is looking at the city. But I'm always intrigued to know whether that's intentional or whether it was a certain moment in the process where the designer finds themselves subconsciously replicating some of the old recognitive rules of the game. I don't think that's necessarily criticism. I think it may be something that, to what extent do you take architecture with you as a system of discrimination, as a system of sort of hierarchies of things that you notice. That's why I found Jeremy's observation about the top and the bottom intriguing, because that in a sense was also a form of cluing or clinging.
I like to think, if it's possible, because we talk a little bit on this in the midterms, about instead of seeing them as buildings or whatever architectonic situation, I see more a possibility actually of seeing them as formations of certain, you know, set up dispositives in the geography that give this type of, you know, cluster or configurations as a sort of result that through time they develop some kind of formation. Like I like this concept that maybe it could not be premeditated, but certain, let's say, dispositives, some biological, some robotic, that work, they are somehow disposed on the land, let's say, or territory, and these, let's say, machines, like for instance, we see in this in one of the projects where there is this type of robotic elements, and then it looked like there is fibrous, a whole kind of constellation that could be biological, or it could be, for instance, thinking about scaffolding in you know, medicine, like creating scaffolding for organs, let's say, a version of that in an architectonic kind of scale, or you know, large site 3D printing, you know, machineries that, given a certain time information, they will actually create a certain type of information. No, I mean, and I think I could see that. I mean, and as a painter, I'm very excited about that idea because it's a sort of process, temporary project where, I don't know, there is suggestions that there could be, again, a dispositive where you accumulate material that is coming from the river, and then that thing start creating formations. Like we talk about camalotes, like all these water lilies and, you know, solar processes, you know, all kinds of, again, you know, just to make it a simple idea, a whole type of dispositives that are local, economical, and they will create some kind of architecture if you give it some information and time.
I would like to say something about the relationship between nature and artifacts and the role that designers could play. For example, in this project, I like this idea of giving life to our artifacts. I can see some hoses or tubes connected to nature. And I think that this is nature feeding other new nature that is growing up there, kind of new, as if designers could give life to another way of thinking nature. And these other artifacts that are kind of, I don't know, if giving some kind of energy to this monster, natural monster, but fabricated by humans. And for me, this is interesting. The discussion is interesting. In this case, it's a kind of biotic monster fabricated by designers, and in this other one, instead of thinking in a processes or an artifact or a dispositive, I would say that this is a kind of yeah, again, abiotic nature created by humans, and in this case, the interaction with nature is different because it's this seems to be more artificial, and then nature could interact, covering with vegetables or green structures that could be up to the roof. But well, I think the discussion is interested in this way of this necessity of designers to create nature in a way, but not only the form of nature, but also giving life to artifacts or giving a kind of some kind of interaction with nature that is beyond the form. That is what suggests to me.
I would like to comment also that following Peter's comment about the stair and in Melody's project, it's true that the stair is very conventional, and it seems that all the imagination and everything that happens in the project, all of the sudden somebody else come and make this very, I don't want to say banal, but very, regular or standard stair. It really shows in the image that it doesn't, it's not connected aesthetically also speaking with the project. But, and the other thing is that to me, which are the two projects are very nice and very exciting about in many ways, but there is something probably in the side, which is the water, and the water has a, the water has a capacity of supported structural, qualities, and both projects are, trying to not to be detached from the water, like this one, for instance, not to touch the water, not probably to have the idea that you can go under the water, that there is another universe also over there, and probably the whole project will be, I might say, almost floating in the water. Fabian also was talking about these robotic columns that probably detach the project from the water instead of, the project could have been like the plants. And also this one that has this kind of yellow lines, because these moments are very nice under the water. But both projects are very interesting in terms of, and I agree with the idea that probably the nature can, grow and cover the whole thing, and the projects are like, an artifact. But then, with the time, they will modify themselves. Also, winter and summer, they will be different because the water goes up and down also in different levels. And there's a moment that you could go under the platform. There's a moment that the water can probably cover the whole project or half of the project, and it will appear as an island, or I don't know. Well, I think the water was not, you didn't take advantage of that other element of the, conceptually speaking, of this particular site, which is in the island.
I was thinking the same as Gerardo, and kind of in opposition of what Fabian said. He said that he thought of these projects as temporary. I think that they have been there for a long time, and this is just a photograph of one moment. And maybe these artifacts that we see as like very artificial is because the type of material that is being used does not interact with weather and other like wind and water in the same way as more natural materials in a way. So the other materials are like changing, like ever changing, and these artificial materials are like are like separating a little more like visually from the rest. So I think that's very interesting, and maybe the project could show like this difference in time and like in seasons, like Gerardo was saying.
Melody, I also appreciate where you were talking about the queer objects and the idea that this kind of whole world that you're setting up might really disorient both humans and other forms of life, other creatures. And I think the studies in the Miro board, I was looking at your material studies, they're really exquisite. Like this opening scene, I absolutely love, because you mentioned that you're working with stone. And it's like, if you think about the discussion of estrangement and Victor Shklovsky and making the stone stonier, you're actually turning the stone into glass. It's just really beautiful. And then I think Ying, I appreciated the way you worked with the cerrito and the idea of the mound as something that normally we would find on a ground, but now you're sort of removing the mound and giving it its own, it's sort of floating like a mass. And so the mound turns into a cloud. So I think both projects are really interested in this idea of kind of material transmutation and how it would disorient us. Beautiful work.
I love that idea of material transmutation, Marceline. That's such a nice way of thinking about these two projects. And I see what you're saying in the boards and in the work of both projects.
Melody, so you know you have comments from Zane in the chat. I just want to make sure that you don't lose it as we move on to the next. Melody, Ying, both of you, fantastic work. Thank you so much. And we're going to move to the next two projects, Joy.
Thank you for the comments.
All right, up next we have Zach and Ishwan. So Zach, go ahead and share your screen first.
Okay, just getting set up here. I'll play this through just since there's audio, and then I'll just try to unpack some of the ideas after. Okay, just give me 1 second. Okay, so just to quickly unpack some of the ideas. Basically what spoke to my interests within the site was obviously the prominent urban and natural divide that you see from the aerial shots. And kind of outside of that was just how infrastructure is like superimposed onto nature. And I used that as a point of departure, basically questioning the relationship and the dichotomy with like the overall goal of trying to blur the line, creating this kind of artificial natural hybrid, but being very literal with the emphasis of one trying to mimic the other. So there's many elements to this kind of system or village that we've been calling it. One hand are the tubes that you're seeing currently. This is basically the hydroponic system. They have several performative aspects, like they aid in the production of crops such as rice and protection from contaminants with like the floods and so forth. And finally, just kind of like aiding in the regrowth and vegetation and adding to the overall like agricultural aspect. And on the other hand is the architectural structures. So looking to the architecture of Argentina, brick is one of the most common materials used. So the plastic in the case of this project is a potential new take on the common brick through these large modular bundles of bottles and plastic waste. And another thing to note is currently there are programs for collecting bottles in Rosario. And this project could be seen like working with these programs and basically having like a permanent solution for the repurpose of the given material. And additionally, the project is trying to be both camouflage but a presence within the site. And perspective is of interest as well. So how the experience is from afar versus up close. Like I really wanted to experiment with, being able to have different meanings and different readings of these kind of habitats. And finally, just to touch on the idea of temporality. In the final scene, you see 20 years down the road, the context just completely consumes the structures and becoming basically what I'm calling this kind of artificial nature. So with that, I can let you move on to the next.
So the movie is not playing just in case that it's playing your screen.
Oh, Ishan, I can't hear you, so you might want to check your mic.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it works now.
Oh, sorry. So the project operates on the original master plan level, and I was initially drawn to this connection between the kind of natural landscape and the city in the background from the river. And I want to create a kind of infrastructure that kind of bleeding the two elements together. And a lot of the forms are derived from like natural elements such as honeycomb, leaves, and branches to reach a point where the nature kind of resample it in a prosthetic way and also like submerged way to offer new program functions such as theater. That's what you're seeing right now. And where the sound of nature could be treasured. I guess I'm playing with how like seeing far, you're looking at almost like a natural landscape movement, but like seeing close, you're realizing like everything was kind of man-made and in a really artistic way. So I'm kind of wanting blending these two kind of elements into a more seamless way rather than kind of embedded them together. So yeah, that kind of concludes my presentation. Bye.
I guess I may jump in. I thought, in particular, the first one, Zach, your project completely blew my mind. I think it's so well done on so many levels. I think the way how you bring together a multitude of topics. I mean, the sort of the kind of, let's say, more conceptual ideas of nature, new nature, but then really undergirded by an actual condition as amplified by the issue of plastic bottles, etc. You know, the kind of mundane quality of something like a hose turning into an animal snake-like creature with particular colors, the way it turns, it becomes all sort of not only artificial, but artistic and animal at the same time. It's just an absolutely stunning piece. And I think, you know, often these projects sort of lean toward one side of the discussion over the other because there's a certain amount of time that all of you have to put into this, or one scale over another. You're really, I mean, it's amazing how you manage. There's also just like, you know, the difference in scale, and there's a certain simplicity to the project, and yet it provides an immense sort of repertoire of different expressions. And again, you know, performative expressions, aesthetic expressions, abstract ones, again, that are sort of tied into the presentation of the film in the way how you bring in sort of explanatory elements and make them also part of the aesthetic experience, like these kinds of moments. I just want to congratulate you as a really, really special project.
I find it intriguing that I don't quite see the same things that you do, but I think it's intriguing to me to see two students, particularly the first one, particularly Zach, where you are almost a throwback to the period of people who really believed in technical consequences. And we had a irrigation system put in our garden a few months ago, and yours is rather pretty, I have to say, and does rather more. I wish ours did, but it's intriguing because in the end, that is sort of what it is. I was also intrigued that you made reference to Argentinian brick. I don't know. I'm afraid I'm going to make a reference to the rival city of Cordoba, where I have been, and I know that, you know, that's a city where a guy called Togo Diaz, as you probably all know, made a fantastic effect upon this city by, you know, manipulating bricks. So I'm a believer in that. I think this first project is very architectural in not the pejorative sense, but I think you produce something. I mean, all the students produce something beautiful. I didn't say that first time around, but I would like to also sort of echo that. But you make something beautiful out of actually what is a very understandable, almost, dare I say, traditional set of maneuvers. I don't know how to say her word, Kai's project also uses this kind of framing. Her staircase is a bit more nightclubby than the first staircase that we saw, but it's intriguing that there again we have this remnant of another world, and I'm intrigued as to how, return to an earlier theme, I'm intrigued what in the process of the metamorphosis that these schemes depend upon, what you leave behind, what you cling on to, and what quite openly you don't mind having there. It's rather like going and discovering a kind of piece of archaeology. But it can be argued that the archaeology gives us messages for today's use. So you have your own inbuilt archaeology, as it were, built into the process of the scheme. And of course, one sees all of these projects, all four so far, as a procedural thing, that it doesn't grow overnight, but as it grows more, the ambiguity between the familiar and the unfamiliar, and between the different constituents of a prosthetic begin to merge. And I think that is fascinating. So again, I can quite easily believe myself into this pair of projects. But I'm fascinated by the what I call, when I say nightclub, you know exactly what I mean. It's kind of it's so unlike the other one, which was raw like a fire escape. This one is being manipulated. So where do you leave behind, or do you consciously cling in the processes? It's probably almost impossible question to answer, because a lot of these things are instinctive, sometimes late at night, whatever.
Yeah, I'd like to echo. I mean, it goes without saying, awesome projects. Both have like incredible qualities, and the mastery in developing the camera work and everything that has been exposed. It's wonderful. I would like to juxtapose the two projects in reference to the title of the studio. So rustic untidiness. Rustic, you know, we can say that is something that is made plain, something, you know, and very, you know, countryside, rural. And untidiness, you know, something that is sloppy. But instead of sloppy, I would like to use disorganized. And both projects, in different ways, I think it's very novel, and at the same time very organized. So I don't know if that's a way of you guys rebelling to the studio, because I think that in the case of SAG, whenever you start and you create your volumes and you show like a view like this, where the bottles are maybe representing something that it has some sort of hair quality. And then as you get closer, you give order to these different pieces that give the indication that these are bottles that, you know, the system has collected. And then at the end, once you fast forward your 20 years, it's kind of like you're saying that, you know, nature won and nature took over, and nature is able to reclaim, you know, what once was our waste. So I think it's a very poetic and very well composed project, and something that is very open to interpretation. And it's up to us to decipher the meanings that you're trying to convey. And in the second project, I really like the way that the order comes once we start recognizing the volumes in the massings, because the way that you are creating this procession through the camera views, we see this vine-looking forms, and it's very difficult to kind of like situate yourself between what is inhabitable and what is, I would say, artificial. And then once we start recognizing the different elements, the different agents that are duplicating and multiplying in the amalgamation of the different modules that you're creating, then we start giving order to the way in which this I'm going to say monument that you have created, it's sitting on the ground, and how it's getting in touch with its surrounding and inviting us to come and experience, whatever event we're able to have here. So both projects are amazing. Congratulations.
I agree. Both projects are absolutely stunning in so many ways, but they're both quite different, right, in your approach to the cinematic narrative. Yishuan, in your project, the way I read your project is as if it's much more atmospheric. It produces a sense of, as if a sense of experience of the place. And I read your project almost as if nature has been hacked somehow, and that this is a kind of result of it. And so, that flickering between nature and what's synthetic is so blurred in a really beautiful way, to sort of kind of create a kind of new awareness of what this might be. And I think that's the most provocative aspect about your project. Zach, your video is really interesting. It's like the most didactic video, but in the most beautiful way. It's as if you are sort of positioning this as a kind of product, right? And I can almost see this being, something that like GE might, want to, or, a 3M or a company like that might want to consider in their maybe new approaches to sustainability. But I think it's so genius in the way that you've activated different ways of animating still images, the way you've moved like light, while the object itself is very still, and the way you show these sort of trying to explain how these things work. I think it's done so well. Congratulations.
I like the type of multidimensional transformal kind of camouflage that the projects have. It looks like there are different type of dispositives that are, like, for instance, the pipes and this sort of active hydroponic kind of system, and you see it happening and performing, and then the whole process of transforming bottles into this sort of kind of a skin, architectural skin. I mean, there are notions of this type of possible thing, process that could be at the same time part of a kind of dystopia, but at the same time an heterotopia and a dystopia altogether. Like if there will try to be a kind of blurring through a kind of the use of, let's say, an altering nature, like if nature as we know it, or the architecture as we know it, will be actually just something already passé. It will be a kind of more biotechnological kind of process. And I like that, because I think we still think that we have a really conventional idea between what is built, what is nature, what is artificial. I mean, we have still science so much advanced in that way. And I like the notion that the two projects actually feel a little bit like contamination maybe is not that bad, or maybe we can do something with it. There are certain desires of a kind of altered nature and an altered type of formation of a new type of architecture that is somehow like I was thinking all the time about Robert Smithson, his notion of the reverse ruin, like if almost like from post-industrial for a post-industrial technology, we actually mutate into a much more, let's say, biotechnological idea of nature. And I like that it's over, the two projects are like a kind of like a little bit of an advertising. Like if a corporation is saying like, well, we can do this with plastic, we can do this with this and that, and they're all possible projects as a leitmotiv to probably the next generation when we get tired of the utopia or going back to nature, this sort of neo-bucolic, and we really get serious and we embrace contamination and all the real problems of the world.
Zaina, you wanted to say something?
No, I mean, I think in my comments probably echoing a lot of the comments earlier. Congratulations to both of you. I think in both projects, there seems to be, maybe differently than the last two, an attention to different scales of detail. So, for example, in Zach's, what I really found really, interesting in the premise, in your conceptual, let's say, approach to the problem, is that you've set up a module to some extent, this sort of spaghetti infrastructure that gets weaved eventually to form the larger scale building is really interesting. So you're starting from a unit that is then, repeated. And by repeating it, it becomes its own structural and sort of tectonic system, and it takes over and it becomes the building. So I really appreciate that you have this like scalar approach to the problem. So at multiple scales, and this unit also appears in different ways. Like for example, in this case where literally the kind of recycled bottle becomes a unit as well. And by repeating it, it forms multiple things at once, the skin, the structure, the image, but also the representation, the reflection of its surroundings. So I found that to be really, really compelling. In the next project, I also find a similar, I mean, in a very different way, a similar approach where you start to see the element that forms also the building itself. So some kind of strange, like spatial truss of some sort, and we can read it as a tectonic thing. It's not just a surface. We can occupy its interior. What I also appreciate about both projects is that they have an approach to kind of the cycle of life of the building. They respond to seasons, they change over time. So the medium, the cinematic medium of the film is, you're taking advantage of that medium. You're using the advantages of this medium that you cannot use in traditional drawings, right? Time, directionality, linear movement and such. And by doing so, you're able to then think of a building that can change over time. And I think you both did that really well. And you're really using the medium in this way, which I think is really interesting.
Okay. Thank you both. Fantastic work. I think we keep moving. Thank you so much, both of you. Congratulations.
All right, up next we have Sojong and Hannah. So Sojong, take it away.
So for my presentation, the narration is incorporated in the video, and I'll play it right now.
Rosario Victoria Bridge, being an artificial object, crosses through the center of the islands to connect two cities. While this artificial bridge bridges two cities, the huge junglescape bridges the islands from above and under the Paraná River. One continuous structure expands the accessibility by connecting three islands that are physically and implicitly divided. This inflated and intertwined structure starts to impact the Rosario Victoria Bridge and reshape it. The exit road created from the interaction of the Rosario Victoria Bridge and the structure provides a direct connection and access from the city, Rosario, to the islands. The underwater connection of the structure allows watercrafts access to the canal possible. The structural junglescape further expands its territory to the interior of the structure. The bridge infuses the artificiality and nature not only through bridging the islands together but also by having the tissue culture lab that explores and experiments the infusion of the regional plants, flora, and fauna for generating deeper relationship and interactions of humans and nature. The experiments of this lab allow us to generate more suitable conditions of the islands for humans, thus introducing artificiality to nature and provide more spaces for nature to coexist with humans in the cities. The structure is a gigantic symbol of genetic modification as it is reflected through the infused landscape of the bridge. This huge junglescape can be accessed both from the river and the shore. The submerged landscape and the structural portion situated on the riverside allow easy access from the Paraná River by watercraft. And the parts of the structure positioned on the islands become the access points for the on-site circulation. 10 years, and centuries in the future, the structure will grow and expand, eventually assisting and replacing the pre-existing bridge, binding the cities and islands through its mass expansion.
Okay, so I'll share my project and then I'll play it through one more time and discuss some of my thoughts. So. So my project is titled Dicero. It's a Latin word for to fix in the earth at intervals, to plant here and there. And what I really wanted to do was to just create this sort of short story, this sort of short film that's this narrative of the relationship between these two buildings and this sort of tension that exists between them on either sides of the bridge. And as the film sort of continues, you're unveiling these layers of mystery and sort of these layers of creepiness, and beginning to understand the sort of effect of these buildings on the rule of Rosario. And what was really sort of important to me was the sort of massive scale of it. From the ground, it's this monolithic creature, but from above, it becomes these very delicate bugs sort of in orbit of one another around the pivot that is this bridge. And I wanted to sort of capture the different, it's lensed by the creatures that would inhabit this space from the grass or from up above in the sky. And it's sort of their account as they're bearing witness to this tale of the two buildings. Yeah. Thank you.
I remember both of these projects, and Seo Jung, sorry if I mispronounce. I remember this initial premise, and one of the things that I think that was added to this, and this is also maybe even touching on some projects we saw before, like Zach's, but there's this idea that our cultures are independent of what we would regard as natural process. And I think that's kind of an unfair distinction, right? We created that distinction. And what kind of keeps this building alive is a cultural process. I like the idea that you've dropped the program in as a part of what keeps this thing alive. Like, I guess an example is like if you look at like a plant, right? And the bottom layer of a plant is hydrotropic. It responds to water, but above it responds to sunlight. That same principle follows, hearing an echo, I don't know, that might be me. Gotcha, thank you. That whole principle, I think, still follows even with our built structures. They respond to different stimuli, usually capital. So like the fiber optics in the ground or beneath the sea are all responding to who has the most money to afford 5G. But it's the same principle that these fibers grow, just like Zach's, hydroponic fibers were growing as a result of some cultural process. And in this case, this cultural process is what is the life and blood of this structure. It's what's keeping this thing alive. And I appreciate that part of this discussion, because I think that's one of the hardest things to grapple with, which is what this studio is really doing, whereas this mixture of artificiality, what's natural, the questioning of that, it's an expression of our larger kind of grappling with these ideas, but that can't be exclusive to just, these materials. It's also cultural process is a part of that conversation. And I feel like, the idea that this is a test subject, is a place of genetic modification, both in its program and in its outward expression, I think kind of gives it another layer of ground that we haven't seen yet. That the idea that these imagined systems that we've created are a part of what are driving a lot of material transformations and growths. I think touching on that is interesting. And Hannah, I appreciate your approach in terms of the dialogue between the two buildings. And I would definitely look into, it looked like it was going more in the direction of a title sequence, more in the direction of an introduction to a movie rather than a movie itself. And I think that might be an avenue to go down. I think the mysteriousness of it is definitely there, where you could be abstract and take it on as a motion graphic piece that kind of speaks to a dialogue between the two buildings. And I don't know, I know that this project is situated at the bridge. So also, what is this thing's identity as a marker of arrival in this place? And is it a dark identity? Is it taking that on as well? I guess I would like to hear like a kind of being deliberate about that, that stance on what these objects are as a result of the larger context of the space. And if that's not a part of the discussion, just not even bring it, just only talk about these two buildings, like not even show that those larger context shots, if they don't kind of speak to that idea of, you know, the mystery between these two buildings observing one another and us taking on the perspective of the creatures that may inhabit them. I think that's all.
I cannot resist to introduce the issue of presentational method. I mean, I take on board the beauty of the things, and I take on board the intention, I hope the intention of the studio, but I was absolutely fascinated to hear in the first presentation an extremely familiar kind of prosaic British voice that's selling washing machines, presenting something which looked extremely commonplace. I mean, the prosaicness of that, it just grabbed me sitting here, not far away from the voice of that lady, but meaning that then the charm, and I use this very dangerous, unfashionable word, charm, because I think there is an aspect when we look at, as somebody said, we're looking at pictures, but there is a certain intriguingness and general sort of charm about the notion of the vegetation, the island, the water, and what can come out of that, even if you almost don't do anything. But then we saw that the bridge was it's intriguing that both of the projects use a bridge, but they're both very different. And then one wanted to see more about the process from which you go from this sort of regular apartment into it developing into something else. It's hinted at, but rather less so than you know, we have these ordinary vegetable racks here, which we're all very familiar with. We even have one in the next room, and then something happens. And I think that the presentational method, you have the student has the power to decide what she will show. You know, you can show us very little hard fact information. You can show much hard fact information. There's an implication that what you will do will be charming and aesthetic, perhaps. The second one was very different because there was immediately a wonderful sense of theatre, and she used a word that I love to use myself, which is creepiness. I'm not suggesting that architecture or this kind of architecture should necessarily be creepy, but creepiness is a form of sort of, come on, it's a form of intrigue. It's a form of a traditional way of introducing a wider range of things to comprehend. It doesn't, you know, creepiness is a form of seduction in a way. And then she used the terms very clearly monolithic and delicate. And it is, of course, many of these projects already are kind of a mixture of the monolith, or what do you leave as a monolith, and how is the delicacy of the process of the change happening. And just as by the way, it occurred to me in the last two projects also that I'm reminded, having a long memory, I'm reminded of a certain moment in architectural history, which was probably sort of Vienna in about 1980, 77, somewhere around there, where there were people like Walter Pichler making these rather similar kinds of things. They didn't have the computer, they were using God knows what, but there was this interest also that people like Pichler had in the old lost cities of South America and so on, that the archaeology, because it has the patina and overgrowth of time, becomes in itself a kind of mixture, a combination of the graspable and the mysterious. But they were it's just a very good pair of projects to make you think about how you get into the story of the bridge and then the growth. Quite different. But I'm sorry, just to finally come back to it, I was fascinated why the student, maybe it's her roommate or somebody, how she chose this. For me, it's so pungent kind of voice. I've heard that voice in the nearest superstore.
I would say that from the first project, I like this idea of plastic nature, because it doesn't want to be similar to nature. It is a difference with other projects that maybe they seem to be alive. In this case, it is a very plastic image of nature, which is something interesting for me. And this other idea of this kind of plastic monster could take over the bridge and transform the way people move in the future. Because I remember in the other review, you didn't make any connection with the bridge, and now there is something interesting there. And in the second, the most interesting thing for me is the mysteriousness of the first seconds of a video, kind of a cartoon, or the mysteriousness that it gives to you when you are looking at it. And it is very artificial, differently to other projects.
I wanted to return to this question of voice. I think, Shojong, it would be amazing if you told the narrative from the perspective of some of the plants or the vegetation, and not this, because I would agree with Peter, I was really jarred by the kind of objective voice. I felt like I was in an airport, listening to some announcement for flights or something. And it felt really disconnected from the world, this amazing saturated world of things that look like creatures or vegetation, or, I'm not sure what different life forms are in there. And so I think you could have this sort of sprinkled with different voices that might kind of start to chatter with one another throughout the film, because I think voice is so important in terms of how it relates to the movement of the camera, where it places us as viewers, who we're listening to, what sounds we're hearing. So I would actually just revisit that and maybe try to graft the narrative in from different perspectives, from non-human actors as well. And I think, Hannah, yours was really quite astonishing in the way that I felt like it really did convey a narrative, even without any spoken word, which is a really difficult thing to do. So I think that's quite amazing. And there were some scenes where, like, coming from below and looking up at this kind of rock outcropping, that, it just sort of, I didn't even need the words to sort of begin to tell me the story of these two cities and the way in which you use that word, the desierto. So I think that they're really beautiful, different examples of how voice and the kind of narrator and the viewer can maybe come together in different ways.
I like to go back to the idea that Jeremy, I think I understood correctly that how nature builds and we build and we learn from nature. We have learned from nature, and we have taken some lectures from nature against nature too, mostly. And the project by Se-Young reminded me of Eric Sanderson argument in Manhattan, where he's a zoologist, and he basically made a book about how the argument was how we reproduce with buildings in Manhattan, the structure, the geological structure, and the natural structure that the place had a tendency to, so that we have skyscrapers where mounds were and where rocks were, and we cross rivers where nature was getting closer and finding proximities, and we use avenues where waterways are underneath the earth, underneath the surface, and so that the project that Sejong has and the position next to the bridge made me think about a construction that intensifies nature, but I think the voice was super important because the voice was like Peter and Marceline remarked, it goes against it's a voice that tells you be safe, but it's not a benign voice. It's a kind of like yes, like the airport voice, like everything's going to be okay, but you feel like you're damaging something at the same time. And so I think the contradiction between a project that rests in nature and grows from nature, and it's and at the same time has these traits was remarkable. I love the color red, the way the color red was used in that first project, and the kind of moodiness of the second project. And so on the aesthetics part of the projects, I appreciate the kind of beats quality, inflated beats quality of the first, and the kind of rock formation of the second one that reminded me of Levius Woods a bit of that kind of war architecture or the kind of landscape of after a nuclear disaster.
Yeah, I would like to say that both projects are super well done in the way that you guys are showcasing the features of the project through the camera. In Hannah's project, I really enjoy that you only show us the entire massing at the end. And I think maybe that's a little bit of shortcoming. I don't think that you have to, like if the idea is to create this smooth through the camera, and this conversation between the camera and us, I don't think that you have to justify the curiosity of the viewer by showing the entire project. And in the first project, for me, everything that you did, I think is very well done. I agree with the comment of the voiceover. Maybe if it was you narrating it, sometimes something that I wish, I often say it, and I wish that I see it. It's like if your native language, it's I don't know, other than English, like you can use your voice and you can use your native language, put subtitles. I think all of us would more than likely, read it. But I would say that for me, the way that you don't have to justify your project is to try to give us a sense of reality by attaching this other program. I think that for me, if you would have said it, I would have believed it. I didn't have to see the section because that took away a little bit of the magic of looking at these forms and seeing how these forms interact with nature and when it becomes part of the bridge. But overall, both great projects and congratulations.
Yeah, one thing that just occurred to me listening to a kind of good amount of time spent on discussing the voice issue. It appears that in a number of these projects, and Peter was talking about the stairs in the first couple of presentations as well, and I think there's something in these projects where the mundane or the everyday or the commercial is somehow brought back or not excluded. And I find that interesting personally. It is jarring. I would agree with all the comments. I would also include this particular view that we're seeing here, where it seems, there's a real sort of jarring difference between, let's say, looking at the project from the top with, the way how it merges with the landscape and so forth, and then the seemingly trivial interior. But it seems deliberate, obviously, in regard to the choice of the program as well, or the notion of an institution, or this kind of institutionalized quality that finds itself back in this sort of utterly, kind of almost grotesque exteriority. And I like that play, and I think the voice to me is a little bit like that too. I mean, I'm also not in love with that particular voice, I have to say, but I kind of think that something happens with these AI or automated voices where the narrator almost merges sort of into the project and becomes sort of remote. It's not like the presenter or the author speaking, but it's almost like something more neutral coming out of the project and speaking. And I don't know, it's worth thinking about this more and debating about it. I like Marcelin's suggestion very much, which I don't think is in contradiction to what I'm kind of speculating. I do think it'd be really interesting to hear, just like we see different perspectives in the second project, there's this beautiful moment of going under the water, for instance. We could, of course, hear different kind of voices, quote unquote, whatever voice means in the context of, something non-human, let's say. But I do find there is something about that, depersonalized, strange, seemingly mundane, because we all know the mundane is not, somebody said it, it's not benign, right? The mundane is actually the sinister. And so if this is sort of deliberately brought into the project and to create some kind of tension, I'm quite interested in that. And I think it's also a particular sort of aesthetic that comes out of it in that juxtaposition, or, what I would call sort of the sinister of the mundane versus what we perceive to be the more novel or the more sort of, in this case, organic, painterly, etc. So anyway, that was just my observation to the whole sort of voice-over discussion.
I think both projects, I mean, the idea of using the bridge also as part of the site, I think is interesting in both, because, the bridge is something very strange, I might say, in the site, in this idea of the city or the nature. I think both projects also, as somebody already said, are dealing with the bridge in a different way. And I think Hannah's project, without touching the bridge, but creating this tension between the new building and the existing building, I do agree with the comment that there's a moment where the camera goes under the water. Is very nice. The music is very also, pertinent, I must say, to the project. Kind of I don't know, it's kind of a tango. There's something in the music very interesting that goes very well with the images. And without touching as I said, the bridge, you create this relationship between these two dancers. I think it's nice. And in the other project, maybe, which I think is interesting, and the images are interesting, but then again, what happened probably in other projects, there is a moment that, I don't know, when the project become like architectural, like laboratories, it goes immediately into a very, bureaucratic image that we imagine, or we have of what a laboratory could be. Because I think the interior of that building would be much, much more interesting if you keep with the same, poison, the same element that you have around. But so there is a dislocation here between this very, very regular, corporative interior office and the rest of the project. But both are very interesting, yes. I wish, I would like to go through the bridge with this element around the bridge. It could be an amazing moment because, it's very interesting, yes. Both projects are interesting, all of them, huh?
Thank you both. Good job, great job. We're gonna move to the next two, Joy.
Great, thank you. Up next, we have Rena and Rob. And Rena, take it away.
Hi everyone. So I'll be playing the video twice, one with the narrative and one without. Enjoy watching. Oh, really? Sorry. Let me share it again. Sorry, it worked as I tested before. I'm not sure why. And I was sharing with the audio selected.
Rena, when you share your screen, there's an option to share the sound with it.
Yeah, I selected one. Not sure why.
Do you want me to play your project on my Vimeo?
Yeah, but I also have maybe we can play that one first, and then I'll exit Zoom, and then I'll play the second video on my computer.
Okay, I'll go ahead and share it. Sure.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Joy. This time I'll share my screen for the second video.
Hello everyone, my name is Capsule B1146. I was manufactured, inflated, and distributed here at the port of the city Rosario. The red one is me. Well, it's not pure red. I think it's the red in between pomegranate and tomato. Here we are, setting off the islands across the Parana River. We rely on and coexist with the flow of water instead of avoiding it. Our mission is to become mobile habitants for anyone who finds us on the shore and bring happiness and joy to them. Most of us would make it to the Delta, but I wasn't fortunate enough. I lost connections with my friends due to a strong current, and now I'm landing on this shore. We're made out of biodegradable materials. If nobody finds me here, I'll become a part of this nature in 10 years. Hey, look! Someone is approaching. This little boy stared at me for a second, and then opened the door, came inside, and tried to move me to the river. It wasn't hard for him to drive, simply pushing and running at the same time. Ooh, be careful! You're all here, my old friends. Looks like they're having fun with human. Thanks to the boy, I finally made it to the village. He found a nice place by a tree and set up the foundation. His family helped placing me and fixing my position. Since the boy still wasn't tall enough, a big rock was placed in front of me as a stair. The sunshine was warm and bright, and the air was quiet and fresh. Now it's time to furnish. The boy placed some pre-cut logs as both floors and staircases. The space was small but right on the spot for a single unit housing. It felt sweet to become not only an object, a transportation tool, but also a home for someone. If the weather is nice, some of us would be moved to the open ground and become sunrooms. If there's a rain or a flood coming, we can also be quickly adjusted to the ready position. We negotiate between the city and the landscape. We travel, we stay. We transport, we house. We're born, we die. We're part of human, we're part of nature. We're a new form of life.
Thank you. These are all.
Hello. I'm going to be doing the same deal, once with sound and then second time with narration. Just to explain a bit about my project, hybrid habitation is exploration to the building of a new landscape, mixing digital methods and techniques with rustic materials and cultures. It grew from an interest in local textile patterns, and sort of the earth is altered with a pixelization technique that divides and abstracts the land. Homesteading as well as informal settlements played heavily in deciding the function of these pixels, with each having different functions necessary for sustenance, as delineated out as such, like shelter, gardening, grazing. In addition, the new landscape was meant to react to the current, to the environment, either acting as packed and firm or becoming more muddied or fluid closer to the river. Shelter is then created through means of printing, with earth from the landscape being brought up from the ground, being extracted and reshaped into these structures through this printing method. Individual or clumping, they offer multiple potential for use and development. Over the time, these structures began to be thought of as shrines, sort of welcoming the fanaticism of folk heroes and the popularism of the spaces create for these enshrinements. The first shrine shown here is of the Shrine of the Outlaw with Gauchito Gil, a local folk hero. I'm sure the Rosario gang knows about him. And then also I hear the Shrine of the Revolutionary portraying a Rosario native, Che Guevara. And so thinking about the future, as we're building this of Earth, there's an understanding that will return to the Earth eventually. Some may stay longer as an island, while other parts may be overtaken by the river vegetation. But we understand it to be ultimately temporary.
These are interesting, obviously, in the way how they differ from the other projects. And I think the first one in particular, because it's almost entirely, I mean, that's actually not true. I wanted to say it's almost entirely narrative based. It's of course not true. I mean, there's obviously form, there's ideas, there's aesthetics, all of it. But it's just basically carried by a particular narrative, and it's really, really well done. It's a beautiful, almost sort of professional level short movie. I'm kind of trying to wrap my head around it, and maybe this is actually a question for the student. There is sort of, you know, a kind of a naivete that plays along with the narrative itself, and you know where we go with it. And I'm my assumption, again, just like in the other projects with the mundane elements, is that that's deliberate. That's not an oversight because everything is done so carefully. So if I assume it's deliberate, I'm interested to hear why you chose that kind of language. I mean, there's a certain cuteness to it. There's a certain naivete. There's a certain way of, you know, maybe it's an optimism in ways, but maybe I'm too cynical just to sort of understand and appreciate that. It seems I'm always waiting for some other thing to happen. Can you maybe just say a couple words in regard to that? how you would position this? I mean, if you want to, if not, if it's something that should be left alone, that I would respect that, of course.
Yeah, of course. I think to me personally, I would wish this kind of like my design to become a strategy in a way, not as like something that can happen right now, but more like a model for this kind of like this particular site in which the city and the island, they can have some kind of negotiation and conversation to each other. And I'm also fascinated by how the site is unstable. So in some way that architecture can be not stable as well. It can move with people and it can be adjusted by people. So that is kind of the idea that I'm proposing right now.
I think there's a clue there then, if following on from Feder's comments, that the human engagement doesn't occur in so many of the projects in the way that it does here, even though it's cartooned. But another thing was crossing my mind with both of these. I wonder what the effect of us all being in sort of various forms of lockdown or detachment has been upon one's individual choice of dream. Yours is coy and sweet and toy-like. It's sort of Teletubbies world, and yet it maintains that with a certain, again, I use this terrible word, charm. We all have sweet memories of childhood. We all enjoy watching a child take joy in certain preferred objects and so on. And you hold on to that rather well. I was resisting the temptation to sing along with the Pink Panther, but we can move past that. Because then your choice of a nostalgia, which you cannot, I don't think you're that old, you cannot possibly have the same nostalgia, but there is always an association, again, of sound and music and musical reference. How do you, it's quite well chosen sort of sweetness of the music to the sweetness of the idea. And I was a bit, I must admit, the first I saw of it, I was a bit irritated. And then I took to it quite rapidly. As soon as the little cartoon figure sort of engaged with it, and then the sort of the notion of it being part of a family, so it's like, you know, you're almost breeding chickens or something. You're breeding these things. And the other thing that intrigued me, but perhaps it wasn't intentional, was the notion of translucency, that it's the graphic that makes your things translucent. But I thought, my God, there's a wonderful avenue of exploration there that could be examined when an object is not necessarily an enclosure. The potential of thinking of these toys, so to speak, as translucent intrigued me. But maybe it's just my own interpretation. The second project, I again had this thought of in lockdown or in detachment, do you come upon that for which you have a natural taste? And I would say that Rob has makes these digital interventions, and then they end up as a sort of stone monument. And I thought, my God, maybe that is his taste. He doesn't call them stone, but they're very much stone monuments. They could have been produced by, 100 slaves with wooden hods or whatever the hell, and you'd arrive at that. And actually, of course, then yes, we have this, which is up on the screen now, which was intriguing because it was a hint of it playing with something else. When you go into the shrine, you're contemplating something else again. So you have the sort of what I call quite clearly monument architecture, and you have the potential of the method to produce another architecture. But what was really great, I think, about these two projects is that they suggest that within your studio, there's a wonderful tolerance of very, very different tastes, because it is sometimes said of SCI-Arc, which I love dearly, that it at a certain moment produces certain shared taste, but in fact, these two projects suggest not. Whether that is in fact because you're all somewhere, and there can't be the physical intimidation of somebody's physically sort of leaning over your shoulder and saying, "You sure you should be doing that?" I'm not sure. That's probably unfair, but I'm intrigued. I think we never admit, and as teachers, I think it's always interesting to use the fact that the designer brings herself or himself with them. You bring yourself with you. You know, I find that in lockdown, I'm referring to what I can see out of the window. And then as you start moving around again, as one does now, then other things crowd in, but it makes you very conscious of choice, taste, reference, even color. I don't know whether either of you two again could comment on that.
I would agree that these two projects are maybe very different from what we've seen so far on multiple levels. I mean, on the one hand, I felt like both projects seem to have switched from, or let's say have switched the tone from a distant third person sort of didactic narrative, the kind of scholar explaining the work, to a first person narrative, right? Where the object in the scene becomes the protagonist, but also the narrator. And it's more evident in this one where the balloon in some ways is the narrator. And then of course in Rob's, I guess I was hoping, since you used Plantasia, I was hoping that maybe the protagonist becomes one of the structures or even the plants themselves. But it seems to suggest that, even though it's not as literal. I also, what I found also interesting and maybe different from what we've seen today is that in both cases, there's maybe a module, but this module is not aggregated. It's repeated, it's reused, but it's not necessarily the brick that becomes the building. It's the building itself. So whether it's the 3D printed sort of temple or pavilion or folly in Rob's film, or whether it's the balloon in Rina's film, both of these, let's say, modules are the buildings. They are the kind of the folly itself, and through the repetition in the scene, they both form a kind of city, a kind of like nature urbanism in some ways. So I found that to be refreshing, maybe a slightly different approach from what we've seen, and maybe also an interesting way of world building, because it's about, again, the unit, the shelter that is repeated rather than the kind of monumental, iconic structure that's reflecting nature. Both really beautiful projects.
Just on that last comment of the use of the word world building, I feel like one, I just want to kind of commend you all for the optimistic undertone in your projects. It's very scary to be optimistic nowadays, and you know, for reasons that are also understandable. But I think it's still courageous to have these visions and to stay true to what you know, in a direction that you think these projects can go. That's very different from other projects. Not saying that the others are pessimistic, but these two, has been stated, have a clearly a different tonality to it. And I think that comes from a level of courage to actually pursue that. So I commend that. And in the case of, with both of these projects, I'd be interested in seeing how an in-depth look at how behavioral changes as a result of these units that you're introducing manifest themselves physically. You know, you've created in this project essentially a home, like it's like an Amazon Prime for a house that the river delivers. And that's going to come with a whole new set of rituals, what it means to wait on a dock for your home, for something that you can inhabit. And with that, a new space to do that. Those points on the dock now become points of someone potentially not having to stand out in the rain, someone who's not lived in an adequate facility to have that moment. And I think there's something to be said about, you know, when it just lands on a coast versus something that's actually facilitating the new behavioral changes that comes with these units that you've created. Then the same with the Rob, your project. I mean, you have this 3D printer that's essentially printing out, if I got it correct, like these spiritual places, these moments where of kind of looking at these shrines. And what does that happen to the culture now? And then how does that manifest itself physically? You know, it's not just a 3D printer anymore, right? It's now delivering, in a sense, a spiritual experience. How do you reinterpret that? So it's, and there's some little alternations that you made where I see the plants growing on the 3D printer, and I think that's interesting. But I think push it further, like really putting yourself, both of you guys have this very personal, like as was said before, this humanity is brought to it. Go inside that person and then really carve out and readjust the space according to those shifts in perception and behavior that you've created. And I know it gets problematic, especially when you're talking about different cultures, but I think even speculating on new forms of rituals that are surrounded by these new technologies that are introduced and these new behavioral patterns is another layer of physical transformation that I think these projects can really put on top as a way forward. I mean, the people that are being impacted here, and I looked at these patterns in the background, and I'm like, those look like QR codes, and why can't they be, right? Why can't you start to integrate, double down on this kind of, what you said, this kind of integration of technology and materiality? Why can't they be QR codes, and why can't they have a whole narrative behind them when I scan it? Why can't this culture want to partake in that? Why can't that be a part of the spiritual experience? But those deliberate behaviors have physical implications that I think adds another layer to all of these projects, and hopefully also starts to acknowledge the problematic pieces. I think that's perfect. I think that's is still, even as an endeavor that's seemingly optimistic. So I don't want to put words in you guys' mouth. Is not necessarily what you said, but it's kind of how it comes off. It still allows us to grapple with a more protopic idea as opposed to utopic, where we're just acknowledging the messiness of dealing with these things and embedding those in the projects and allowing ourselves to critique it physically through the form of these projects and the nature in which you kind of display them. But I do appreciate, you know, I think it means something that there's a different approach here, and it's a sign of courage. And I definitely appreciate that courageousness. And I do think they're, you know, very beautiful projects that have a lot more into them than what we're seeing today. And I'd be interested in seeing how they grow.
You know, Jeremy, you said something really interesting in terms of the ritual for me, in the sense that we don't usually think of architecture anymore in relationship to rites and rituals. And in one way, it's interesting because, of course, it's so disciplinarily embedded in architecture, these particular issues, right? But since modernism, at least, perhaps going back to, you know, Enlightenment and so forth, this has been sort of moved away, right? It's often been described as a process of, you know, demystifying nature in order to cultivate it and use it as a resource and basically get rid of the things that do not, you know, fit in a scientific understanding of what nature means, either in a scientific understanding or one that's sort of, let's say, romantic, you know, in the sense that we find ourselves reflected in one way or another through nature. And it seems the idea to perhaps to develop new kinds of rituals, to me, is very compelling. And these rituals are not exclusively human, but it's also the ritual of that, you know, rather stupid, and again, I'm assuming entirely deliberately stupid mechanism of that 3D printer, right? It just does something that is rather square format, etc. And I think I like that very much in the project, that it doesn't begin to actually do the types of forms that other parts in the architecture do in this project, as well as in some of the other projects. But there is something that is ritualistic in the way how the 3D printer works, And to have that juxtaposed with the barcode elements that look like the skin of a cow, and then you actually also see the cow, there seems something going on here that I find really interesting. And when I heard the word ritual, it sort of, in my mind at least, clicked together that, to a certain degree, for me, these projects, all of them, in one way or another, are trying to reflect on our new relationship with nature, or the kind of technological synthetic understanding of nature, or the impossibility of separation between nature and technology and so forth, that turns into new forms of ritualistic behavior. And through that, some kind of architectural idea or design can emerge. That's somewhat radically different. Now, I don't know if we are yet seeing that in the evidence of the design, the radical difference, but I think it's somehow implied in the work overall. And I don't know, I find that, quite compelling.
On that note, thank you. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Rina. Great job. We're gonna move to the last two projects of the day, and hang in there. We're almost there.
All right, last but not least, we have Yutao and Charlene.
Hi, I'm Yutao. I'm gonna play first, and then the second time I'm gonna do some explanation. Thank you. So basically, my project aims to create a micro-nature and ecosystem for multi-species of creatures. I call it Almu. It's a fictional giant insect that lives in the sea of corruption from the film, reference film by Hayao Miyake, the Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. And as a hyper-artificial creature, it slowly grows and becomes a habitat for human and other animals. Burst with a halo cavity and several holes like a sponge. The skin has a mixed texture of tree trunk and crystal gel, which helps it camouflage into the existing vegetation beside the Paraná River. Its body surface is highly moisturized, so mushroom grows wildly everywhere. The lake deeply rooted itself into the riverbed and lifts the main body high up. It also stops it from being flooded when the water rises. The amber-like hemospheres are secretions of almu. They are initially shaped as full sphere. Once they grow too heavy that almu can't carry them, they will be thrown into the Parana River. This process will help purify the water by absorbing harmful chemical elements and settle the soil. The secretion contain most of the nutrition a plant needs, so we carve them into hemisphere to grow crops on them. This new type of vertical farm helps stop agricultural pollution caused by flooding happens in Delta. The amber can be easily reshaped under the high temperature on the site, so we can use it directly to build a vertical transport system. Some of them have artificial caps to create capsule-like space that will not flood even during the wet season. As an expansion of nature, it's more than just a vertical farm. This reimagined landscape consists of human beings, habitats, and playgrounds of wild animals. It builds a unique relationship between man and nature and shows a new possibility of living. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I think next one is Charlene.
Yeah. Mm. So, hi everyone, this is Charlene. I will give a brief introduction as the start of the video. The project is telling a story about how the superfungi, the mycelium, grows extensively and creates a new territory for human beings and also a habitat for other species. The life cycle includes accumulation and erosion, death and rebirth. It will constantly exist on the land, but still eventually be part of the ruin. Yeah, that's it.
I love that both of these are dealing with literally sort of really living matter. When you talked about secretions of omu, I was like, oh yeah, of course. Suddenly this omu becomes quite real, and the idea that it would have these secretions and people would kind of live inside of them and birds would live inside of them. And then these amazing scenes. I mean, it's just exquisite the way that these the secretion is sort of rendered as something, you know, it's kind of viscous, not really solid, not totally liquid. And then it's beautiful when it kind of drops into the water and makes that splash. And then we start to think about how it becomes part of the water itself, and maybe the water comes from omu. And so you invent this whole kind of mythology for us. It's just really, really stunning. Really, congratulations. Super, super commendable. It's just incredible. And Charlene, I love the fact that you're dealing with mycelium and this material that literally would be a kind of fungal growth. And so the project would evolve and change over time. I think they're just both very beautiful projects.
Marceline, I'm glad you made the statement before me about this living matter. It really was the thing that struck me about both, and the methodology of conveying that was really quite clear. I think the first project, immediately one has a sense of the exotic, but then the clue is in this animalistic gulping. Yes, fish-like gulping, and immediately you get this living matter sense. And then I also enjoyed the way that it used the water. Some of the projects have been on the island but haven't said much about the water. In this case, there's an almost insidious seeping into the water. And then there's the other sort of living matter idea, at least, of the secretions. And that this hyper-artificial creature, I think, was explained there was a very clear intention when Yoteo talked about it. It was a very clear statement of intent, and I would just love to see more of the same project. It's the sort of thing that I'd like to see another, couple of months where it gets even more living and even more exotic. I also very much enjoyed Shiling's project, which, if the first instinct of the first project is the exotica, the second has this mystery. It has a sort of brooding quality, which I think is something that's quite difficult to capture. And then in her case, the living matter, it's the use of this moment when it sparkles. It's very critical, I think. And it occurs to me that, of course, underlying all of these, I think there hasn't been a bummer in the whole group, actually, if I may say so. And then I remember something which I'd like to drag in, which is, although Hanan always gives the impression of being very reasonable and hands-off, I remember, admitted more than once that he originally wanted to be a filmmaker. And here he has this studio, this school, which, and it's, coincidentally near Hollywood, so one can't help think this through, that you are in fact the films, and the reason why one discusses not only the things themselves, but the sequence, the method, the reference to sound and so on, is because most architecture schools, even if they're radical, they keep within the boundaries of only as much narrative as to explain, and consistency tends to crop up even in the most other radical schools. But here, one is enjoying the inconsistency. One's enjoying the fact that you're moving into the imagination, in and out of the imagination. And if somebody like me then makes references to things they've seen before, that's not necessarily pejorative. It's merely that there have been other generations of people who've also tried to think outside the architectural box. I'm loving it, as they say. And so I don't be so. I mean, one of the things I notice, which is fashionable now, is to not sort of say anything too critical about anything. In detail, every one of the projects has bits when you go slightly, but I think overall, it's not. I'm not dismissing it as filmmaking. This is really a positive. I think it's a wonderful studio. I'm gushing a bit. I'll shut up.
I like the fact that these two projects are, let's say, more concrete in this sort of, I don't know, the things that resonate in the studio in general, this type of organic processes and secretions and stratifications, and I still think about this like not they're like provisional architectonic configurations that maybe are not, they are suggested by certain processes that have been set on site, and then they took a certain type of process, and through building and destruction, decay, grow, overlap, somehow become something, or like an architectonic situation. I really like these two projects because they have, this one, for instance, have this sort of nervous system, this kind of erectile sensibility in a way. And of course, it's just a suggestion, but there is a really interesting relation between a possible space and a kind of nervous system, and how we relate and how we think about neurology and possible structures, architectonic structures, and I like pretty much the first project because of this idea of the secretion. I mean, and as an artist, there is a lot of, I'm a painter, so painting is always related, and art in general, to secretions. It's a really typical thing in art to think about secretion, fluidity, certain disgustingness, but it's not really typical in architecture, at least in my visiting to schools and things like that. There is this type of more related to building and to the constructive, and this project create all these type of course, associations to the pictorial in the way that it deals a lot with this type of coagulation of material, a certain alchemy that is quite interesting. And again, it feels as a sort of process that somehow, through a certain relation to nature or altering nature, will end up with some kind of a provisional architecture. And I actually like that because there is all this collection of events or maybe material process of means of production that have been more than presented, more suggested, but they could be interesting futures for architecture.
Maybe to pick up on Fabian's last point of interesting futures, what I find striking, and that's usually the case in Hernan Studios, but maybe particularly in this one, is indeed how the architecture cannot be without the film, and the film or the movie cannot be without the architecture. It seems they have really become such an integral unit, the way it's edited and with the sound and everything else. And yet clearly to me, these are architectural projects. And clearly they're also movies. They're not one or the other. It's not architecture depicted in a movie. It's not architecture animated to become a movie, but actually they are in a reciprocity, bound in an interesting reciprocity. And like I said, this format I'm obviously familiar with for many, many, many years now. I've been coming to Hanan's reviews probably for 20 years, and animation was always one of his interests in terms of presentation. But it seems it has really gotten to the point where that reciprocity for me is incredibly alive, incredibly active. And it's just really compelling to watch these over and over. And my mind switches back and forth between the architectural and again, the sort of the movie related or the film related. I mean, that's one larger observation I have, since everybody started talking a little bit like closing comments. I may do that as well. I mean, that's one of the larger observations I have. The other is, again, the question of what is the image of the future that we as architects want to depict. And with image, again, I mean the architectural image of the future, but architecture in the widest sense, like we're discussing it here with these projects. And it seems the very clear answer of the studio is one of re-enchantment. Right? It's like sort of, there is a positive approach to this new hybrid between nature, technology, culture that will re-enchant the world in sometimes, very cute, picturesque ways, sometimes in more eerie and mysterious ways. We've seen a number of different aesthetic approaches, but re-enchantment seems to be the case in all of these. And maybe that's the positive or the optimistic element that we discussed a couple of projects earlier. There's sort of, you guys are all going for it. You're not tiptoeing around it. You're just out there. And I love that. I generally love that because I love design. But I also think, it was mentioned earlier in terms of the times we're in, I find it particularly refreshing to participate in your projects.
Maybe I'll jump in. It's not necessarily a closing comment. I would agree with all the comments. I really think both projects are beautifully rendered, and they both take on this question of how the building or the structure becomes nature and sort of regenerate itself in a really interesting way. So there's no, let's say, as William was saying, the relationship between nature and the synthetic are one, and they're not competing. I agree. Both buildings are alive, literally. What I thought was missing, especially in Charlene's project, is the life cycle of the fungi in some ways. I almost wondered if the structure could harvest yeast and through fermentation maybe would sort of constantly recreate its skin, its sort of fiber from the mycelium. It would regenerate itself, which actually in the earlier diagrams, it suggests that it has a capacity to kind of keep growing. But then in the renders, in the animations, we lose that that effect of the potentially regenerative skin. But that's in some ways what's really exciting about mycelium, especially in the recent research about material and biomaterials with mycelium. Yuta, really beautiful presentation. I also really appreciated the narrative. I saw your thesis prep work earlier in the semester, and you're really good at sort of writing these fictions. You're a good script writer in some ways, right? So we were very, your writing is very convincing. We are in the world that you've created. You have characters and such, and I thought that was really, convincing with the images. The Umu metaphor is very whimsical and really surprising. It's very strange because, you know, when you think of Umu, especially in like cartoons, they're these kind of like strange, weird creatures. But what I thought was missing, I mean, you really elegantly translated it, by the way. But what I thought was missing is really the experience of occupying the second skin, so of the Umu. So here in these moments, we're inside some of the nooks, but we're never really in that, let's say, poché space, like the kind of the thickness, which I kept thinking as we were watching, I'd like to see what would happen if we were in between the two layers. That would be really nice. But yes, I mean, seems like the future is fungi. So congratulations.
I mean, I don't think there's much more to be said. These are gorgeous projects all across the board. In regards to these two, I mean, you guys really, I feel like, embodied the studio. I was so interested in, as one of the details I remember from midterm is the distinction between, one, Utah, I love how you adapted this project from midterm. You kept all of the same fundamental ideas and then pushed them further. And it's a clear growth. The idea that there was going to be some involvement with sediment was always there, but now you have these kind of dynamic capsules and excretions that come out of your building that partake in that. And I think it's brilliant. And that opening shot, you know, where you see the difference between the water that's sediment filled to the clear water, you know, you just really, you really pulled it off, and I commend you. And I'm so interested in this object. You know, it's hard to even call it a building anymore. And I think that's a part of the success of it, is this entity that you've created. If it reproduces, you know, if there's actually a moment in the future where we pull out and realize this very intimate moment we had is actually something that we see at multiple stages along this water system. And that in fact, those excretions weren't just ways of trapping sediment, there are also some ways of its reproduction cycle, and like pushing that narrative and opening it up even further on a larger world building scale. Not saying that that's the right direction to go, but it's just, there's so much with this one entity that you've created, a mythology, as was pointed out, and a world is here. And you know, the jarringness of the people wearing plain clothes like that we associate with today and seeing them inside of that, I think if that's deliberate, I would love to enter that world. And you know, I don't know if there's I remember there was a reference to potential fish farming, and you've taken a different type of agricultural approach, and I think it's an amazing project. And also the Shanning, the play with fungi at every level, I think was just very successful. The moment we open up, it looks like I don't know if you guys seen it, these little blobs that are in the street sometimes, like these molds that look like dog barf, but it's actually a form of like growth. Yeah, I know. But it looks like that, and that's the fascinating part about it, is the moment you said it, I was like, that is very successful. It looks like a very successful growth of some form of mold or fungi. But then you kept going in, like you just kept going into each layer and showing us how this mechanism is reproducing itself, both conceptually and just, you know, ecologically, like at every level. And I think it's just very successful. So really, really gorgeous work. I'll drop the proper name to the dog barf in the chat so you guys can know what I'm talking
about. So, well, I think we are coming to a closing, to an end. So first and foremost, I want to thank the students for all the work, and on top of everything in these incredibly difficult circumstances that everybody's operating. So it's very much appreciated, and we feel incredibly proud of the work that you've done. I want to thank Joy and Pedro for the whole semester. It has been a lot of fun and excitement. And then I want to thank all the critics: William, Seina, Ferda, Gerardo, Marceline, Jeremy, Peter, Your Highness, I can't believe it's 2 a.m. in London.
I'm having a great party, you know. The only time I'm this awake in the middle of the night is when it's good times. It's a great party apart from everything else.
That's the
great.
spirit.
Fabian, thank you if I mention, and all the other jurors that they have to leave for one reason or another. This has been a lot of fun and a true pleasure to share the work of the students with all of you. So hopefully we will be soon. Hopefully soon we can see each other in person and have a food or a drink or whatever we can do together. So I will ask the students to hang around for 5 minutes. Peter, what is that? The Scotch?
No, it's a rather good Beaujolais.
Oh, okay. There you go.
I like the paintings in the background, Peter.
Yeah. What do you want me to say?
Very nice.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ferda, as well. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you when the clouds bring us to town, I guess.
Exactly. Good night.
Thanks for having me.
Night.
Oh,
Great work.
good night.
Good night.